Hi, happy holidays from the Blue Boar Tavern to all our loyal, very loyal viewing family, Blue Boar visitors. Thank you. Come on in. Happy holidays. Sit at your tables, order your favorite eggnog, mulled wine, whatever you like. We're brought to you, as usual, by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Look up our website. I want to say a special thanks to all our future YouTube viewers. If you like what you find here, whether you watch every month, every episode, or whether you're new to this, if you like what you see, like, subscribe. It really helps spread the word to other Shakespeare, doubters out there. If you're not a member, look up our website, Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Look for lots of interesting articles, past issues of our newsletter and journal, the Oxfordian. I always say, don't just go by what the Shakespeare professors say that doubters say or believe, or the reasons we supposedly doubt. Cough, snobbery, cough. Just go look into it for yourself. So thank you all, like and subscribe. And our guests should be showing up here soon. I am not seeing them on my screen here. Here comes our Phoebe. I was just telling him about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, Phoebe, and I think you have some words on that.
Do I? Wow, I'm so bubbling over with Yuletide cheer. Jonathan, can you see, first of all, am I too low in the screen? Can people see
No,
that I'm
you're
wearing
fine.
an exciting shirt that is a Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship shirt? And not only that, but in a special for the holidays, I'm going to share some exciting new items that our wonderful membership can get in on. Wait, why can I not pull it up? Oh my goodness. Well, I was going to say I'm having some technical difficulties, but
Live broadcast.
there's a we have a Earl of Oxford ornament. We have a cocoa mug with Edward de Vere in a Santa hat, and we also have a red hat with Edward de Vere in a Santa hat, as well as hi Dorothea.
Hi,
Um,
Phoebe. Hi, Jonathan.
oh, okay, yes, here we go. Look at this exciting
There it
beanie,
is.
and we can also for this is the wonderful Christmas ornament for only $14 that you can hang on your tree. And then we also have a special Delia Bacon special edition items designed by wonderful Lyle Colombo in order to celebrate the legacy of one of our movement's founders. So all of these items and more can be found on our merch website, and I'm going to drop the link in our chat, and hopefully folks will also enjoy our wonderful Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship merch celebrating Edward de Vere and also Delia Bacon, and all proceeds go to the SOF.
Make it an Oxford Christmas.
Hey,
Or
there we go.
Hanukkah, or
A very Merry Christmas.
Very Merry Christmas. You
no,
didn't do that one, did you, Phoebe? Did you do that Very Merry?
I did. That was the
just made it up.
email blast
Oh, it
Oh,
was
you
subject.
did.
okay.
Okay.
All
So
right.
everybody,
But I can tell you read
go
it
to the
really
website. Go to
attentively.
the website. It's all there. Hi,
Please,
everybody.
folks, in the chat, give your own Oxford Christmas puns.
Yes, Dorothea Bonner, Alex, hello. I was just
Hello.
telling people that it's especially important that our guests today chat amongst yourself, but with us through the chat buttons and the question and answer button at your table, because it's become a holiday Blue Boar tradition that we come in cold with no plans and no preparation on our part, because one of our frustrations is through the year we have a lot of good discussion from our guests and visitors and commentary going on and good questions, but we can't get to them all because we lose our focus entirely and become completely disjointed here. So this is the time of year where we just open it up to our live viewers, and we'll keep dipping into the Q&As and the comments and bring up what you want, subjects you want, questions you have. If we don't know, we'll say we don't know, or we'll say what we think, because it's all about the discussion and asking questions. So anyone have any words before we just open things up?
No, I think that we can go
No.
ahead and start. If we don't have any, I think we probably have some questions for each other ourselves, but let's see what people have on their minds.
Okay, let's see. Hello from Northern California, from Ohio, from California, from England. I love England.
I'm
Adelaide.
seeing
Adelaide.
Malvolio in the Dark Room. Is that a reference to the Inquisition?
Oh,
Interesting.
okay. There's our first question. Oh, we've got some up and Q and A's, but do we want to start with? Well, it's coming up to 12th night here. I just watched a version of it. Do, do we think Malvolio is a reference to Inquisition? Nobody expects the
I've
Spanish
never thought of that.
Inquisition. I never have
No.
either.
I never have either. I don't have any thoughts on that. We are actually our next program is going to be on 12th night on 12th night. So
Mm.
maybe we need to do some research on that if we don't know the answer tonight.
The only thing that's coming to mind for me is it's making me think of and I think maybe this is in Shakespeare by another name, talking about Caliban and the kind of comparisons between, like, I think there was like an Inuit that was brought to England and kind of put on display in sort of like a zoo or something like that, like as sort of a current event. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? The idea that Caliban might have been inspired in some ways that Edward de Vere might have seen. There was sort of a kind of a like an in poor taste display that was, and I think it was like an Inuit person who was brought to kind of put on display, and they kind of died in captivity in England or something like that. And I think the implication was that
There,
perhaps
there were
that
some
colored
native
the New
There were
World.
some Native Americans that were brought from Penobscot Bay in Maine on a ship that Southampton owned called the Archangel that went out in 1604 and came back several months later. And those Native Americans did spend time at the English court, but they were Penobscot. No, we don't know this. This is not a fact. It seems reasonable to conclude they were Penobscot Native Americans from Maine, which is the predominant folks that are, have inhabited that area for thousands of years. So it's possible that that was the reference.
Well,
Can't say.
To
I guess
Malvolio?
1604 feels
No,
a
Malvolio?
no,
little late.
we're talking about Caliban, not
Oh, we
Malvolio.
got
I
to
don't have
lose
an
it.
answer for the Caliban for the question about Malvolio. I'm
Yeah,
so sorry.
I've never thought of that
Wow.
either.
Man, okay, wow. Manteo and what Juan Chese stayed at Walter Raleigh's house. They were from North Carolina. Interesting. Well, obviously that's too late, 1604 for it to be you know, a reference to that in The Tempest, unless the Stratfordians are right and it was written after
Well, I
1611.
mean,
Oh no, we've
you
just
got 6 months.
two Indians came over in 1585. Sure.
Hmm.
So there was a question for Bonner. Did Bonner get my question about it? Just flipped off my screen.
Oh,
Maybe
Did
Jonathan
oh,
did
yes.
Bonner get my question on Thomasine Ostler and the Globe Blackfriar lease shares?
Yes, that is a very significant thing because what happened is in 1615, a year before Mr. Stratford died in 1616, Thomasine Ostler, who was Hemming's daughter, John Hemming's daughter, sued her father over shares of the Globe. There was a lawsuit. And in the pleadings that were put first of the lawsuit, it said that William Shakespeare was a deceased gentleman. It named the deceased gentleman from the troupe, from the company of actors, and it named William Shakespeare, however you want to look at it, because it's in Latin, I think. But it lists him as being deceased. And I do have, my mother looked into that, and she was able to get two very excellent Latinists and archivists to read it to see if there were any way we're making a mistake because the pleadings are in Latin, and we're not. That particular set it indicates that William Shakespeare, whoever he was, is deceased a year before the man from Stratford's deceased. Now it's funny. I thank Ken for bringing this up because it's a very interesting point. It sort of gets obliterated and nobody really focuses on it. But, it's maybe one of those anomalies that we see all over the place in this thing. Things just aren't what they seem. But I do have, my mother did have it in her files from two very, very fine Latinists and archivists that this is exactly what these pleadings say.
So it could go to what Tom Woosnam was talking about in a recent episode about how there could have been multiple William Shakespeares and they're conflating them all together. You think
That
that might be it?
that is plausible. That is very plausible. Yes.
Uh, and they just ignore that because this document doesn't fit
It
their
doesn't fit
timeline.
the exactly. It doesn't fit
Narrative.
the narrative. That's for sure.
Ah, Ken says, thanks, Bonner.
Okay, thank you, kid, for asking.
Let's see. Um, Here's a question. This was sort of something on my mind too. If you use the techniques of an orthodox biographer, where could have, should have, and likely substitute for evidence, how do you think the contemporaries of the Stratford man would describe his character and life? And I know I was thinking about that after Tom's presentation. Is what do we know of his personality? What would have his people in his own town, Stratford, have thought of him, let alone actors? And would he have been this beloved figure there, or
He was litigious. I think we can say that. He's involved in a lot of lawsuits.
Well, who doesn't love kids?
Yeah.
kind
That
of
doesn't make him a bad
small-minded?
person. It doesn't make him a
No,
bad person.
just
But
kind
he,
of small-minded in
No,
the
not,
yeah.
not necessarily. He's a
Well,
man who's, I'm going to argue for him. I'm going to take the other
okay,
side here.
sure, good, good.
Well, he
And
was,
He was a man who knew his rights and he stood up for himself in court. Wasn't a pushover. That's my
he
take
was
on it.
tough.
He was
It
tough,
looks like he
but
was
he was
tough.
fair.
Yeah, not meek
Maybe.
and gentle.
My only impression of his personality is like I think there's two things that I connect together, whereas he seems to have this sort of sarcastic sense of humor, where when you see he finally first his or his father's application for a coat of arms is rejected and it gets stamped by like some bureaucrat and it says without right. And so
No,
then
without right.
when he finally gets his coat of arms, it's like not without right, or in French, non sans droit or whatever. And so that to me, I feel a lot of emotion in that. It's like somebody was very offended and felt angry that they weren't given this, social status at the time. And so then finally they get their kind of sassy reply, and it's like not without right. And that's like a rejoinder to that. And that to me also kind of rhymes in my mind with the sort of second best bed. And so I can't, I'm sure maybe Bonner is, more an expert on the kind of interpretation of the second best bed, but to me, I'm like, here's a really sarcastic person who seems to have this sort of dark sense of humor, and definitely revenge is a dish best served cold, right? Like however many years it was, the rejection of the application to the not without right, I finally got the coat of arms, versus like I'm literally going to give you an insult in my will. So somebody who really was like ready for a slow burn, sassy comeback to me is sort of my impression of his personality, just based on those two little anecdotal things.
Alex, any thoughts?
Well, one of the things I find interesting is that there's only two contemporary references that anybody ever spoke to him. One of them is the town clerk of Stratford about a property measure. I think it's about enclosing some lands. And the town clerk reports, yes, I talked to Mr. Shakespeare about it. And the other one is connected to the Balot Mountjoy lawsuit over the dowry. Some of the other deponents who lived in the same rooming house said they had discussed the issue with Mr. Shakespeare, but none of those are the only contemporaneous records. I'm not counting Ben Jonson talking to Drummond in 1619. These are ones that actually occurred at the same time. And that's to me, very puzzling, and indicates somebody certainly not living in the literary world.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me, and I don't know where I heard this, maybe back on the old days when there was an email chat group at some point, but it's always stuck with me of there's apparently a document, I hope people out there know and can say more about this, that talks about during that time of hoarding, because Shakespeare was brought up for hoarding grain during a time of famine. There was talk among the citizens of Stratford about wanting to hang some of the hoarders in their doorways. And it didn't list him specifically, but sounded like that would have applied to him among others. I mean, I don't see that making him beloved among the people of Stratford if at some point they're talking about hanging him in his doorway. So I'm just wondering if anyone knows more about that because I've never been able to find what that is.
So does his will, which of course is a subject in and of itself, vast interest for what it does contain as well as for what it doesn't contain. Is there any bequest to anything having to do with the town in that will?
No, no, there's none. And the real shocking thing is there's no bequest to the Stratford Grammar School, which is where,
Yes.
according to the narrative, he learned all the magnificent amount of knowledge, gained the knowledge that enabled him to write the greatest literature for his country, for which he is greatly beloved in future generations. And in future, speaking of future generations, his own progeny, his own grandchildren and their children's children would go to that school, and he did nothing for it.
Hmm.
And in fact, Dr. Robin Fox, who's really the expert on that because he was a very fine anthropologist, as many of you know, cultural anthropologist, and he did quite a study of grammar schools. And he said that it was mandated that if a local boy made good going somewhere, which is what we're told in the narrative, Mr. Shakespeare went to London and he did all this wonderful stuff, that he would go back home and do something to endow the school there for the community. And he did not.
So
So
it
it's,
seems like from the documents, there wasn't this mutually loving relationship between him and the town that we could tell.
Well,
yeah.
of course,
He
it would have
also,
been it
sorry.
would have been his male issue who would have gone to the school, but nevertheless, he made no provision for the education of his daughters or his granddaughter,
Right.
which was not uncommon at all for people of means and people who were literate. They understood and valued the importance of literacy, and they
Oh,
would make arrangements for the
absolutely.
education of their female relatives.
At home,
Absolutely.
always,
I can,
always at home.
Yeah.
but there are just gazillions, almost every will when they're young minor children and the father or grandfather is dying, the words that he provides for them for their you see the word for their education or to be brought up in learning. You'll see that phrase over and over again. And what Mr. Shakespeare did is he gave a number of shillings to his godson. I forget now whether it was 40 shillings or something. And he wrote to my godson, and this is a minor child, 40 shillings, and I think that's the amount in gold. I found a will with exactly the same words and exactly the same, a woman, testator, it leaves 40 shillings for my godson to buy him books. That it was a great awareness throughout all the different echelons of people up and down the social structure that education was very important and it was the steps that you took to a better life as we know today, but they understood it pretty well. You will hardly, I was looking, it was on my punch list to look for how many people, if they provided for minor children or grandchildren or friends' children, how often they wanted that money to go for they use that word education
And
or
yet,
learn. And our
and
guy
yet it didn't
doesn't,
spring to his mind.
it just wasn't on his mind.
Uh,
Folks, while we're talking about shaky, I'm seeing two questions from
yes.
members about Hamnet, including one from Jared Randolph, who I want to shout out. I saw in the Bay Area recently his really exciting play, Shakespeare's Shadow, which talks about the Shakespeare authorship question and stuff. So just shout out to what Jared's doing in the theater community. And so two people are asking, what are we going to talk about when Hamnet gets the general public thinking about Shakespeare? Are we prepared? I don't know if I'm. My therapist is on speed dial for a Hamnet Oscars season.
Oh, that's funny.
Actually, that brings up a question that I have. We often hear that the names Hamnet and Hamlet were interchangeable.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, is that actually true or is that a Stratfordian myth? Does anybody in the crowd have an answer to that?
Maybe we should, first of all, I'm just going to respond to that. Maybe we should have a YouTube video that we make, which is like, is Hamnet and Hamlet the same thing? Or we should make like the SOF should produce kind of a debunking Hamnet YouTube video for when people are talking about that. I think that would be a
Yeah,
good idea.
It's something
just
to
for
address
those
it. Yes. Yes.
for those who may not know, Shakespeare's twins, Hamnet and Judith, were named for their friends, Hamnet and Judith Sadler. the Shakespeare parents' friends. So the name didn't come out of nowhere, and it came out of a personal connection that Shakespeare would have had, and his wife, I presumably.
It's named
Hamnet's in the
after-
will, right? The
It was,
Sadlers?
yeah, it was from neighbors, right?
Mhm.
Good friends and neighbors,
Yeah,
or
I don't know if Hamnet would have been deceased because he
yes,
died
he
at
was
age
11.
11, 1596, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, they suspect drowning, maybe, but it's not a definite thing, I think. So they tie that into Hamlet, of course. Somebody drowned, his son drowned. I always use this as a reason to bring up when I'm in comment threads with Stratfordians, things like, oh, well, Hamnet was named after Hamlet. And it's like, well, wait a minute, we're constantly told that he didn't write autobiographically, and he left all signs of himself out of his work. But now he suddenly does write autobiographically. So what are the rules here?
Great point, Jonathan. Great point. No, he
Um,
doesn't write his own life except for when he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, Hamlet, I'm seeing Hamlet is not Hamnet. We can counter the Stratford myth with the fact that elements of the play was cribbed from a French story involving one Hamlet.
Hamlet.
There was that musical on Broadway. God, what was it called? Something Rotten. And in it, the whole thing was that they went back in time. It was somebody who was like jealous of Shakespeare. And so then they were going to put on a show, and a psychic was like, here, you can preempt Shakespeare's greatest hit by writing the show he's about to write. And then it's called Omelet. I didn't see the show, but I heard about this. So
Michelle says there's a lot of, sorry.
maybe next year we can do Omelet.
Yeah, Michelle says there's a lot of discussion on reviews of Hamnet on the web. So maybe we can incorporate that into something coming up while it's still fresh. A couple of people have asked this too, while we're on the subject of the Stratford guy. Was Stratford's Shakespeare an actor? On what do you base your opinion? I fall toward yes, maybe not a big one, not a star, but he's listed enough as a player even after his death that he seems to have done some acting. I don't know if it was his main occupation or if he did it for a shorter time than people might think. But at some point, I would say he probably was.
I have several takes on that over the years, and I get asked that. I've been asked that question too.
Yeah.
And for one thing, I find it difficult to believe. Now, I know you're an actor, Jonathan, and I've asked other actors, and they like the idea. But they'll say, well, maybe all he did was walk out on the stage with a sword or something, and say, yes, my liege, or have some little small.
Yeah.
But basically, I think it's very odd if he was an actor that no one saw him act. Because acting is something you do in front of people by definition. So my very first thing, and remember, when in the early 1590s, when Venus and Adonis came out, that poem, a pamphlet it's called, just took the crowd by storm. It was a bestseller, and it had the name William Shakespeare affixed to not to the title page, but to the dedication of Southampton, which made a big deal. It was a big deal. And if he is an actor on the public stage, I just find it difficult to believe that somebody in the thousands and thousands of people who went to the theater, that's what we're told. We're told all kinds of things.
Yeah, that's what we're told.
Tell
Yes,
that up. Yeah. So, and that brings me around to something that I had been thinking about and wanted to prepare, if I may be so bold as to show you. Tom was, it was a follow-up to something Tom said at the last Blue Boar, that he found that the reference to William Shakespeare in the will of the other actor, Augustine Phillips, is one of is probably, he thinks, the most convincing piece of evidence that Mr. Shakespeare, I like to call him Mr. Shakespeare, to give him the respect that he should have as a gentleman if back then, but that he was an actor. And I've been suspicious of that reference for a long time. And I looked for that first page. It's on the first page of the will. The will is 2 pages. Can we get that on? I sent it out. Can we do a screen sharing? I just want everybody to eyeball. Like we say, eyeball. This is Augustine Phillips' last will and testament, made up a few days before Augustine Phillips died. And if you'll click now down to the 2 pages of the will, it's on the next slide. Can it be clicked to? There it is. There are the 2 pages of the will. Is that sort of shocking? You definitely have 2 different handwritings. And in the Playhouse Wills, where this will is transcribed by one of the best transcribers in the business, she says very clearly that you're looking at 2 different handwritings. You've got 2 different texts. forms of secretary. And strangely enough, can you flip down to the next one? Can you click down? Okay, the one on the left, and by the way, is Mr. Shakespeare's 5 lines from the bottom, is, quote, according to this transcriber, a small and unusually angular form of secretary. The one on the right is a more standard facile secretary hand, which is one of the styles that you see the most often. But obviously, you've got two different writers here. I am suspicious. I've been suspicious long before I ever was able to see what this first page, that it was recopied from a first page that would have matched the second page. And it was, and I know I'm suspicious. Sorry to be overly, whatever the right word to be too suspicious about this, but I believe that it starts, as you'll see, with the lines more spaced up at the top and the words more spaced as it gets closer to the bottom. The lines get tighter and the words get closer together and smaller and smaller. I believe that the copyist was adding some material to this. It was not in the original page that he was copying. Now, that's just me. That's just what I think. Uh, so, but we don't have a matching 2 pages of the will, not by any means.
Bonner, have you run across other instances of two different handwritings on the wills you've examined?
I have not, because I have primarily used transcripts, and you have to be very careful with transcripts. We're stuck with using them because most of us can't begin to read secretary hand. I've worked hard to learn a little bit, and I have a moderate ability now after putting a great deal of effort into it. But mostly I use transcripts, so I don't get to see the originals. I did go through Playhouse wills. I went through all 130 something wills, and all transcribed by the same transcriber of this will. And there are a lot of times when you have mixed hand, but I don't believe by when she says something's in a mixed hand that she means two separate pages. I think she means that the letters in a word, like say the word, just pick a word like bequest, that you'll see the letters, that there were several types of, so let me preface this by saying there were about 5 different types of secretary hand that you see, and facile is the one you see the most. That as time went by, some of the writers, the scribes, the scriveners, would use different types of letters from different types of styles. So that's why they end up with a mixed hand. What you see here in this, and I'm going to look for it because I do have some wills that I've called up in the original, and I don't think you'll see a whole page done in a totally different hand, and the next page. That's not what they mean by a mixed hand. That's what they might like you to
Honor.
they believe, but I don't believe that's what you have. I think this is very unique.
Honor,
Yes.
is it possible that the second page of the will caught fire, got wine spilled on it, someone got destroyed and a different scribe,
Well,
not necessarily with nefarious intent, but just finished the will out. They sat down and took their form and talked to him. And did he authenticate the pages in any way? It's too tiny.
that's a wonderful question. But let me say that the second page is the one that's original.
Okay, so
The
the
first
first
page is
page
the
is
one
not.
and yes, and the reason it's original is one, down at the bottom it has A. Phillips, and I've tried to find another copy of Phillips' signature. It's in italics, which would be what most of the signatures are. And Dr. Frank Davis had a wonderful article about this a while back. But even scriveners who wrote in secretary hand often sign their name in italics. That's usual.
Sure.
It also has the what they call the probate clause down at this lower right corner, which should match the probate clause that's in the regular record. So I would say with those two things, it's the second page that's original. So if something happened and there was some reason that the first page didn't survive,
Yeah.
maybe that would be
Destroyed.
an explanation.
Yeah, it burnt, the candle caught it, and the whole thing all
What about
over
the
again.
inter-
I mean,
what
I'm
about the
gonna
interlineations? Like the added, I've heard that there are things that are added in later, like the rings to the actors. Which page is that on?
Okay, you go click down to the next slide, and I'll show you where it is. It's on the first page, and it's 5 lines from the bottom. That is fellow William
okay.
Shakespeare, and 30 shillings in gold. Interestingly, I sent all of this to Tom Woosum, and he referred all my information over to AI, and AI said that this was in the middle of the page, which is why it's more logical that it was in part of the original writing. And it's not in the original. It's not in the middle of the page. It's 5 lines from the bottom.
Right.
This AI, of course, I realize AI is a machine and it picks up whatever it's
Hey,
picking up.
Connor,
But
for people who don't know the relationship between Augustine, who is Augustine? Could you just fill that in a
Yeah,
little
I
bit?
was
Because
just about to ask, how does
I
this
think
tie
it's a
into?
really interesting story, and I bet there are a lot of people
Yeah,
who don't know.
Interesting. I was looking it up in some documentation, and Augustine Phillips was one of the leading actors with first the Lord Chamberlain's men, and then it became the King's men. And when the King James became king, and he sent out first a warrant, and then they turned into letters patent to turn Lord Chamberlain's men into King's men. Augustine Phillips' name is I think he's the fourth one. You do see William Shakespeare, you see Lawrence Fletcher, which is interesting because Lawrence Fletcher didn't come down from Scotland, which is another thing that needs to be explored a little bit more. And then you see Augustine Phillips, right, either the third or fourth name. So he's really way up there as one of the leading, most recognizable actors in this troupe, in this company of actors. But also interestingly, after the Essex Rebellion in February of 1601, when when the investigation was going on, he is the actor that was called in by the investigators and he gave to explain what his company was doing, performing William Shakespeare's Richard II. Now, I ask you, if Mr. Shakespeare would happen to be around, what are they doing talking to Augustine Phillips and not William Shakespeare?
Good question.
But Augustine Phillips was a very recognizable actor with the company. And he died about 2 years in 1605, about 2 years after King James became king. And he also seems to have been a musician. And in his will, he left a lot of musical instruments. He also had two apprentices. He had a former apprentice and he had a current apprentice. And our Mr. Shakespeare has no apprentices at his will.
Hmm.
It's just he has no record of theatric shares that he's supposed to be a sharer, but he doesn't have that in his will. The will of our Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford is really very strange
yeah,
and seriously absent of things that it ought to have if the story were true and he was an actor.
yeah.
Hmm.
Ron has a comment here that I've never thought of this before, but it makes sense to me, saying, I tend to believe the term player was a generic term that described anyone involved in the production of plays. Therefore, he could have just been a prop handler or an extra with non-speaking roles. And think of Hamlet saying the players are coming, and he doesn't mean every single one of them is an actor. He's talking about the theater company as the players.
Holding the
So I
horse.
could see that.
Wasn't that right? Holding the reins of the horses? Wasn't that one of his
Yeah,
jobs?
yeah, he could have been. It could just mean he's with the theater
I
company
was shouldn't
doing
make fun of him.
pretty small
Yeah.
scale stuff, uh,
Mm.
as among one of his many business portfolio activities,
Yes,
like
yes.
selling stone and grain and hay and
Side
things like
hustle.
that.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I was just gonna throw in one of the questions from the
Sure,
Q&A from but if Bonner, if you're all right, I'll throw it in and then you can weave it in with whatever. Or
we'll
so
do
this
the
is a
weave.
this is a question. Is there any extant evidence that Mary Sidney had a hand in editing and compiling the first folio? Did she have a documented connection with Ben Jonson? I just want to throw in this is like I think a colorful anecdote that people will enjoy. This past summer, I was at UCLA for a week doing like a medieval manuscripts course. And I was kind of like keeping it under wraps for the first couple of days that I was an Oxfordian, just because I didn't want to like alienate people or seem weird. But then, like lunch on Wednesday, I was sitting with three other people, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm interested in the Shakespeare authorship question." I think it was I'm an Oxfordian. And then at the table, this one woman, she goes, I'm an Oxfordian. And then another woman goes, I'm here because I'm studying handwriting because I believe Mary Sidney wrote Shakespeare. And so I'm trying to see, I think in the Sidney, she said something really interesting. It was like a Mary Sidney Salter, where she says that there's a female style of handwriting that was different from men. And so she wanted to prove that there was something, a
Huh.
document that she found where the Mary Sidney's female handwriting was in somewhere that maybe people expected it to be like only Philip Sidney's handwriting. And so I thought that was really interesting. And just the fact that and it was really funny because there was a fourth person sitting with us, and he was like, I've never even heard of the Shakespeare authorship question. Or it's like, he's like, I always heard it was like this kind of, not serious or, not worth noticing. He's like, but here I am at this table. And he's like, there's three women who are like obsessed with it. So he was like that. It was just funny that I ran into these other people who were kind of on the similar, on fellow travelers on the path where I least expected it. So that was kind of an encouraging sign. And for
After
what it's
we
worth,
address this question, I'm going to go back to a previous question somebody asked related to this sort of very thing, but let's
great.
stick with
Yeah. And I'll just
uh,
say like it was encouraging because the woman who said she was an Oxfordian, she's a librarian at Pomona. So I'm like, we're making inroads.
so about evidence of her hand in the first folio. Any documented connection with Ben Jonson? I mean, he was sort of in with them, wasn't he?
No, Ben Jonson was very close to the Pembroke family. He dedicated his poems to her older son, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, and he was very close to both to Susan. He wrote epigrams to Susan and many. In fact, the Pembroke family were Ben Jonson's closest and most important patrons
He
through a
lived with
long
them,
period
tutored
of
the
time.
kids for a while, right? Didn't he live with them for a while?
He actually lived, I think that in Margaret Hannay's book about Mary Sidney Roth, who
I'm
is
reading that right now. Yeah.
okay, it's a wonderful book, and that the Hannay, who's really a fabulous scholar and really got into a lot of archival material that most of us didn't know about. That's one of the beauties of that book, but that he lived with her younger brother. Robert Sidney was the younger brother of Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, and that he lived over at Penshurst with that line of the Sidney family, and was the tutor of one of their sons. So the families were close. There's no doubt about it, and he was quite close to, of course, Mary Sidney's two sons. Because he saw, I think he was responsible for the first folio for editing it, and he saw that the first folio was dedicated to the incomparable pair of brethren who are Mary Sidney's two sons. So that's a very strong connection of Mary
And
Sidney.
it's documented and
It's
well
powerful.
documented. Yeah.
Somewhere, somehow, something is going on there.
And I think in the recent book, Elizabeth Winkler's book, she goes into Mary Sidney's connection this to Shakespeare and having the strange statue of stage Shakespeare in her grounds and things like that. So there was something going on with her and Shakespeare. I don't
Yeah.
think she wrote it, but
We also got a question about somebody whose friend is a Henry Neville fan. Can we compare and contrast the strengths and weaknesses for Henry Neville versus Oxford? I guess I'll just start off by saying, and this because this is what I'll tell people if they're like, well, I've heard it's, Thomas North or all these other people. I'll say, once you are introduced to the idea that it wasn't the Stratford man or that the story that you've gotten, traditionally is wrong, it's this big kind of like eye-opening seeing through the matrix moment where all of a sudden you're like, wow, that's so compelling. And so then probably once you've been primed to kind of reject the Stratfordian narrative, probably the first person who's at least somewhat within the milieu of like the, Elizabethan court, and you can make a stronger case for that person that's much stronger than the Stratford case. And so that's probably what you'll get really excited about. And so for me, I think that Edward de Vere, once you've kind of debunked the Stratford thing, has the most positive evidence. Like even there's another question about like Hamlet. You can look at all the correspondences between Edward de Vere's life and Hamlet, which I don't think lines up in the same way for Neville or for North or for Amelia Bassano or any of these other people. But I'm comfortable enough with people who have kind of been taken down the path far enough to reject the Stratfordian framework, and then you can kind of compare and contrast.
Jonathan, can we change the subject? There was a question kind of early on that I saw flip by, but I don't think got answered.
yeah.
It was a question whether John de Vere was actually murdered. Can you go
Okay. Yeah, I
back
saw
to
that
that
one whiz by.
question? Because we've,
Uh,
can you find it again? It was an interesting question. I might be able to answer a little bit of it.
It's early on in the chat.
It's early on in the chat, or if the person who wrote it would kindly put it back in again, it'll maybe easier to find. But I think the question was, does anybody think that John de Vere, Edward de Vere's father, the 16th Earl, was murdered?
in
and
order to give someone else control over his.
give someone else control. And I think, I
That'd
mean,
be the-
what I've discovered in doing some research, and it's one of the themes that I work on all the time, is that there was a long-standing enmity between the Dudleys and the de Veres, and that goes back a couple of generations. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester's grandfather, was attainted for treason, as was his father. When his father was attainted for treason, John de Vere was in charge of the Tower, and so, of course, physically took possession of him and put him in the Tower. Their houses were very close to each other, around St. Swithin's. But the most significant piece, I think, and it sets up this rivalry between Robert and Edward de Vere that is truly lifelong, is that Robert Dudley's very first military command was given to him by his father to take men and take physical possession of Mary Tudor before she became queen. So Robert at 21, Lady Jane is the Dudleys' preferred candidate, and they have her all set up, crowned. Mary Tudor needs to be taken off the scene. So Robert's father sends his middle son, Robert, off at 21 to do this task, and Mary Tudor, who becomes Mary I of England, takes off the day before Robert arrives. She makes this huge circular trip. She ends up going to Essex, where guess who joins her? John de Vere. And they meet in battle, and Robert is terribly defeated. Mary, of course, is not captured. Robert joins his father and three of his other brothers in the Tower, where he remains for 18 months. So all because of John de Vere. So John de Vere, I think, has sort of one of those, let's make it up and be friends. And so he names as what we might call executors of his will, three men, one of which is Robert Dudley. And the other two executors, for various reasons that Nina Green explains in beautiful detail, and I don't want to go into here, but sort of end up off the scene. And that leaves Robert Dudley, before he is Earl of Leicester, in possession of all of the properties, of the de Vere properties. The Queen grants those to him. I think that's where the money comes that finances his rise in court. Is siphoning off the money from the de Vere estates. He even takes from Marjorie Golding de Vere, Edward's mother, the corn off the lands that she brought as a dowry when she married the 16th Earl. And I don't know what you guys know about land law, but to this day, crops that are growing in the ground belong to the person who planted them, not to the person who either takes the land at the end of a lease or by purchase. Those crops belong to he or she who planted it. So this pillaging of the de Vere estates definitely has to do with this rivalry that goes back at least two, possibly three generations between these families. But if you can just imagine Oxford and Leicester trying to one-up each other through the theater companies, through the affections of the Queen, through who is the best horseman, through who is the best swordsman, it just escalates and escalates. So do I know whether John was killed? I think that was the question. If you believe Hamlet is exceptionally autobiographical, it might be possible. Certainly John de Vere dies under very suspicious circumstances, only a few days after he comes back from London, having made his will and entered into a betrothal agreement for his only son and heir, Edward. And then he mysteriously dies. And then, was it, now Bonner may tell me she thinks it's our nefarious William Cecil, but I don't know. I think it's Dudley. Whether John de Vere caught something in London, a virus, we might say today, that a disease that took him out, whether he was, I don't think he meant to die because he wouldn't have set up this betrothal that had conditions that needed to be met in the future. I don't think he, knew he was ill on death's door, but he did die very suddenly, and that provides all sorts of wonderful opportunity for speculation.
Can we speak to? I'll ask the question, Bonner, and then you can answer it.
Okay, just want to point out a wonderful article by Nina Green called "The Fall of the House of Oxford."
That's it.
Which she details a lot of the enormous effort that the Queen made, that put her hand on the scale to see that Dudley got the estates. And
that's where my information's from, Bonner. Is that fabulous article?
Yeah. Out of it.
Fabulous article.
And I also want to point out there's another very fine historian. Her name's Alison Ware. She's published lots of books. She's a good historian. She does good, and she writes well. So she has kind of done a crossover from an academic historian to a popularized historian. But she noted that, of course, there are lots of suspicious circumstances surrounding these very important people, one of which was the death of Amy Robsart, which has gone down as one of history's mysteries. And it was Alison Ware who said this. I'm stunned to read this in one of her books, that the beneficiary of the death of Amy Robsart, who, people may or may not know, this was Robert Dudley's wife. And early in Elizabeth's reign, when she was so passionately in love with him, her courtiers around her were terrified she would lose it and marry Robert Dudley, but he couldn't get married because he already had a wife. But then,
thank goodness.
He mysteriously ends up very suspicious circumstances. She ends up dead at the bottom of the stairs at the country manor home where she's living. And Dudley he was brought news of it. And he knew immediately that this was going to look really bad for him, that he killed his wife to free himself up to marry the Queen, would be the first thing that people would think. And it was the end of their, at that particular point in time, romance that he was having with the Queen. And it reflected poorly on Dudley. It's interesting because I have tracked this down, and this is going to be dangerous for me to say this. It might get me in trouble. But there have been 5 deaths that were under suspicious circumstances, of which, I'm quoting Alison Ware, William Cecil was an enormous beneficiary of these 5 deaths. I may have sent that to you, Dorothea, in an email.
Well, we talked about this.
I know you think it was Cecil.
Yeah, when it was I brought with our Renaissance letters episode.
Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm seeing. Yeah.
Okay. If that's it's a little bit. I may not be smart to walk the plank on that one, but there were
since 2 of you have brought it up, where can Nina Green's that paper be
On
found?
her website?
Here, I'll drop it in the chat. Or it's also, I'm seeing it on the SOF website, so I'll drop it in the chat.
Oh, there it is. There, somebody put it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
When I sent the link earlier, did it only go to the host and panelists when I sent out? Yes, when I sent out the merch shop link, it only went to the host and panelists. So I'm going to send that to everyone now as well.
Send it out again. Yeah. But you're.
I have a question what I was going to ask. I'm curious to learn more about John, the 16th Earl, and I'm also seeing a question about his theatrical troupe. But for me, I'm curious. He seems like, based on what I've read, I mean, in Alan Nelson, I guess, or which is obviously a grain of salt. It's a rough customer. A rough customer. The story about the woman getting her nose cut off or something, where he sends a gang of people to kind of chop her nose off. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know that story, but if you take a look at the nobility of England switching between Protestant to Catholic to Protestant, and people changing teams in a most expedient manner not to have their families persecuted. These men in these positions of power in various parts of the country were asked to make some very harsh decisions in order to support the religion of whoever was sitting on the throne. So if there's some very lighthearted stories about him as well, which show a different side of his character. Again, they're only stories, and we are not necessarily have the opportunity of cross-examining those who write them. But there's a wonderful story about John de Vere that he was hunting in France, hunting boar, and he stepped off his horse in order to use the outside garden facilities for the necessity, and turned around and found himself face to face with a boar. And the story goes that he whipped out his dancing sword because, with a boar, you have to have a boar spear, which is like 12 feet long with this huge iron point on it, which you slam the butt of it into the dirt in order to hold it steady while the boar comes charging at you. It pierces through its breast. Anyway, the story is that he killed the boar with the dancing sword. And when he was discovered having killed the boar by the French, his comment was, well, in my country, boys of 12 could do the same. So a man of wit. It may be an apocryphal tale. It may be his apocryphal tale about himself, but nevertheless, a fun story.
I think it would be fun in a future episode to really talk more about Edward de Vere's parents, who I think we know not enough about. Natalie Crow put in the post, I think, yeah, this rings a bell. It was John de Vere's mistress, kind of, he tried to run away with, but then she's the one who's like fallen upon by a gang, and it was like a common thing. It was like a tar and feathering thing, but they would kind of cut your nose off, and this happens to his, I guess, ex-girlfriend. So it's sort of an ugly episode that I would love to understand better or know more
But
about.
it's not that he did it, it's that people who worked for him did it. That doesn't
I
necessarily.
was under the impression, and I haven't looked at this recently, but I was under the impression that the people who attacked his girlfriend, I don't know if you want to call her that, he was separated from his wife, the Neville, who was a Neville, and that it was some of the Neville family thugs, and they're all of they call them servants, but they were surrounded by all of these henchmen and bodyguards, whatever. It was some of people from the Neville family group that did that to get her, because they were representing his wife, and that was the reason for the attack on the girlfriend. I don't know.
So Edward de
Maybe we
Vere,
could do an
obviously
episode.
he lost his father fairly early in his life
When
and
he was
got
12,
moved to
yeah.
other influences. But going back to about John's theatrical troupe, do we have much idea if Edward de Vere came from a cultured
Oh, big
artistic
time.
family?
I think John de Vere had two troops, did he not? He supported two troops for a while. So I think the assumption that one draws is that there was a lot of theater in that household. And it was something that was
literature, anything like that?
greatly celebrated and enjoyed by the family.
Yeah, was it a literary household? Would he have gotten any of that early on, or did that come later
yeah,
on?
sure.
Education?
Considering that, of course, Marjorie Golding's brother, her half-brother,
well,
was his
yeah,
tutor.
of course.
So,
Well,
we have
before
to.
that, Thomas Smith, starting when he was 4,
Yeah.
he was
Oh, okay,
shipped
that
out
early.
for.
And
Yeah,
his time
yeah.
at Cambridge and Oxford. I mean, I think it'd be cool. I'm thinking it'd be cool to do an episode about like Edward de Vere before he turns 12,
Well,
like
that'd
his
be fun.
childhood,
Yeah, that's
where we
what
can
I'm
talk
thinking.
about
Yeah.
his
That'd be a lot
tutors,
of
his
fun.
academic career at university, his interactions with Elizabeth, perhaps, and his earliest activities.
Okay, let's see what else we've got.
Okay, I have two questions here that this is sort of going meta, like stepping out of the weeds of all this information and addressing how we approach things with the public. Somebody asked, I don't know that we can get into this, about what you said, Phoebe, when you're in a seminar or a play or production or something like that, how do you walk the line of being an Oxfordian without being overbearing, maybe, or maybe we can tie that into this. Tom, who was our visitor last week, I'm just going to read what he says, and it ties into somebody else who had said, how does one avoid being a victim of confirmation bias? And maybe that ties in here. Tom says, the circumstantial evidence for Edward de Vere is, in my view, more than enough to convict him in absentia of being the author of the works. But circumstantial evidence is neither proof of guilt nor immutable truth. We only have to look at how many people have been found guilty on circumstantial evidence and shown later to be innocent. In that light, this is going to the whole big meta, how our organization approaches the public. What smoking gun did the SOF discover that allows it in its Oxfordian narrative to assert without doubt whatsoever that William Shakespeare was the pen name used by Edward de Vere? And to me, I'm hearing that kind of uncomfortable, because I'm I get wary of anyone being too certain about anything ever. So how do you avoid confirmation bias or being too certain? How should we walk among the public with this? Because frankly, Stratfordians are way too certain for me, and think believing something is a tiny step to thinking you know it, which is a slippery slope to making a lot of stuff up. Or any thoughts on that related to these?
Well,
Avoid confirmation bias.
all of history is subject to that problem. All of human history is subject to that problem. There's very little of our history as a race that actually has a smoking gun. It would have to be fairly recent history. It would have to be exceptionally well documented history. I think it is fairly safe to say that because of the extraordinarily careful and massive amounts of records that the Germans kept, that the Holocaust did occur. We also have living people who we can make judgment about their veracity as witnesses who witnessed what went on. But apart from an event like that, that was widespread and the documentation still exists and there's lots and lots of witnesses to it, it is impossible to say that any statement of fact in all of history has ever happened. There is no proof that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The reason we all learn that Caesar crossed the Rubicon is that Caesar himself wrote that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. But is Caesar a liar?
And that's how myths form that get transmogrified into
That's right. Caesar was a politician. He was a general with a really big ego. Do you think he lied? Maybe.
So maybe
we can never know.
Lightly. Yeah.
So we will never know almost every piece of history. That's my answer. And as a lawyer, the laws are very imperfect. We tend to, in our general conversation, throw a lot of legal terms around that belong only in the courtroom. But human beings, as witnesses, are subject to misremembering things, not on purpose, forgetting, making things up in order to look good, covering for someone else, including themselves, and downright lying. So the fact that someone is convicted on circumstantial evidence, there are also people who have done terrible crimes who are exonerated and let go. But that is the legal system where a volume of circumstantial evidence can be used to persuade people to make a decision where there aren't clear facts. In the world of science, many sciences, not all, the science about the stars, for example, is nothing we can ever prove. There's no smoking gun about the galaxy because we cannot go there. But in a lot of science, in a lot of mathematics, there is proof, that smoking gun. There's certainly a lot of legal cases, one 100 years ago, about 50 miles south of where I live here, where a man was shot by civilians outside of a general store. A group of about 20 people gunned down a really evil man in cold blood. And then what started happening is some of them said, I never pulled the trigger. I wasn't there. He shot. I didn't. I never held the gun. I wasn't even in the crowd. I was across the street, right? So smoking guns indeed, but in whose hands? And that's the way history is. We have no smoking gun that Marlowe wrote, Dido, Queen of Carthage. Robert Prechter has a credible theory that Edward de Vere was involved in writing part of that. Is Prechter right? I don't know, but his theory.
Well, I think this goes to Tom's question about
it does.
Should we be stating it as an objective fact that he was Shakespeare when, as you say, there isn't never a smoking gun and we don't know. But where Stratfordians know everything, and that's one reason we have such a
I think the term smoking gun is kind of a red herring. I think the question is, if you were to preface accurately, I believe Caesar crossed the Rubicon. right? You would have to preface every historical statement you ever make with "I believe" or "I have read that," unless you yourself experienced it.
Any
And
thoughts? Anyone
that
else?
becomes an impossibility within
No.
the field.
Anyone? Any thoughts? Anyone
That's
else?
my answer.
Alex, you're raising.
Well, I'm reminded, I think the person who gave the keynote address in New Orleans, or maybe it was Denver, was it Roz Barber? Anyway, she said we need to get used to the idea of uncertainty.
Yes, I love
There
that.
are things
I
that
love
we
that.
do not know. There are things, to paraphrase one of my favorites, Don Rumsfeld, there are things we don't even know that we don't know. The unknown unknown rather than the known unknown. And that's the way it is, especially for something where it appears that parts of the quote documentary record have been expunged or tampered with. And so we have to accept that. To me, the biggest factor in favor of Edward de Vere, at least as principal author, is the vast collection, the vast evidence of his life experience as reflected in the Shakespeare canon. That's not to say that other people may not have participated in it, either after his death or at the same contemporaneously with him. That's all possible. I sometimes tout Percy Allen, one of the early Oxfordians who wrote 100 years ago. That's pretty much exactly what he said. He has plenty of ideas about collaboration, and he came up with this decades ago.
But of course,
Phoebe? It's almost wrap up time, but I want to give Phoebe and Bonner a chance to jump in on that last issue there.
My only jump in on the last issue is another plug for the for
The
the
merchandise.
merch shop. So I'm happy to see my time to Bonner.
Well, actually, I had this conversation almost with Margot Anderson a while back, and she told me that, of course, she has written a major biography of Edward de Vere, did enormously wonderful research in it, that we've got enough evidence, even with uncertainty, to be stating our case. And I will stand corrected if I misrepresent anything that she told me, but that we should be stating our case with a certain degree. We should be reasonable. We shouldn't be adamant, but we are entitled to have a certain degree of certainty about what we're saying. And
A strong degree of confidence.
That's very well done. Yes.
Well put.
Very good. So that just throw that out. I wanted to say we went off on another track, and I was going to toss the ball to Alec to say just a few words to circle back to Diana Price's wonderful book that pointed out the discrepancies and the deficiencies in the Stratford man's biography. And one thing that she talks about that is so many things in her book are good too, and that the deficiencies and the places where the actors are acting. This goes back to, was Mr. Shakespeare an actor? And the places where we know they were acting, we somehow, for a very important time, was when the actors of the King's Men were part of the entertainment of the diplomats, embassy that came from Spain to negotiate the peace in 1604. I think that's August of 1604. And Diana Price proves that Mr. Shakespeare, there's great evidence for what evidence is worth through his little petty stuff that he's doing, that he's in Stratford upon Avon. And he doesn't really he'd have to be going back and forth and back and forth. And that part in her book, I didn't have the exact dates, but Alec, do you recall that?
No, not specifically, but the book, besides her chart of comparing him to 24 other authors for other evidence, corroborative evidence of being known as a playwright or a writer, that's what stands out the most. But the rest of the book is quite good too. Yes, no question about that.
I do remember the part where she talks about he was performing at court with his theater company, and other records show that at the exact same time he was in Stratford doing little mundane business. And she says, how do they deal with that? They put them in different chapters and hope nobody will notice the conflicting timeline. Okay, I think we're wrapping it up. Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you so much. Sorry to all the people who've been writing comments and questions. If we didn't get to it, you're all wonderful. That's the realities of time management. So happy holidays, everyone. Do you want to put in a last plug, Phoebe?
I think let me see. I'll put it one more time, the link down here. Get it for your trees,
Support
folks.
the Shakespeare
Get it
Oxford
for
Fellowship.
for your hat.
Get cool
And thank
stuff.
you. Yeah, and thank you to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship for promoting this fun monthly Blue Boar Tavern. So if you want to show your support, maybe we should make Blue Boar Tavern shirts. All right, sorry, I gotta stop thinking out
We
loud.
do. We need to start providing mugs like this. That's an idea. Somebody gave me that one. So okay,
right.
thank you,
Work
everybody.
on that.
Thanks to our technical gremlins,
Yes.
and
Yes,
we love
indeed.
you all. Thank you.
Happy holidays.